In light of the racial tensions that we've seen in the past year, like anybody, I want to be a part of the solution. I mean, great efforts have been made in the last year to bring understanding between races in our church and to create peace through forgiveness, reconciliation, racial awareness. But something's missing. You know, it's been a year now since the George Floyd murder, and those responsible for it are being held accountable, and the laws are changing, actually. And that's a good thing. But the social events of 2020, they've revealed something disturbing about our fellowship, and that's that we have a deep racial disconnection. And forgiveness and reconciliation doesn't seem to solve it. I mean, I love our leadership. I'm a part of it. But despite our efforts, it seems like some of the more fundamental lessons that we should all be learning from this moment aren't quite getting through to everybody. And from what I can see, some of the disciples aren't connecting their behavior or our church culture with the social responsibilities that come with the task of seeking and saving all nations. So these hurtful interactions with white disciples, they just keep happening. And I'm seeking our success, so I want to offer whatever I can here to help us understand and respond to this moment more effectively. And in this video, I'm going to be describing the racial dynamics in our church as I've witnessed them and offer some possible solutions. So what do I mean when I say there are fundamental lessons that are being missed? Well, I see some sobering parallels between our church's social dynamics and the methods of oppression that are used by the nations of the world. Let me take a second to explain that. You see, the primary methods used to create an oppressive environment are delegitimization, dehumanization, and marginalization. Now, dehumanization means to diminish the value or the relevance of a person's life experiences. Dehumanization means to diminish the human connection that allows us to have the same sympathy for others as we do for ourselves. And marginalization means to relegate a person or a group to the outer edges of social normalcy, acceptance, or priority. And these methods of oppression are most successful when they're normalized in society through laws, policy, culture, and the manipulation of popular opinion, usually done through media. In other words, society becomes desensitized and perhaps even self-justified to inflict damage on its own people for the benefit of the dominant culture of the dominant society. And nearly every country throughout history has used this process to some extent. And in America, we pretty much perfected it here. We have, though, in America, what seems to me like an oppressive personality disorder that produces this toxic, unhealthy, dominant culture. And racism is just one of the many facets that are found within it. You know, throughout history, these methods of oppression, they've always produced the same two results. Number one, an uncared for, exploited group of people. And two, a society that allows it. And secondly, it places on the oppressed people a near impossible set of expectations. So they basically have to deny who they are, where they've come from, and they have to endure abuse from the dominant culture in order to assimilate into its social structure, which, by the way, I might add, is not designed to fully embrace their attempts to do so. And Christianity in America, for the most part, has a 400-year-long history of adhering to this unhealthy, dominant culture rather than speaking against it. And our fellowship hasn't been immune to this. The influence of racism and white supremacy over the years has cultivated within our church a situation to be woefully unprepared, untrained, and uneducated to combat situations like the ones we saw in the conflicts of 2020. And it showed. When all that happened, we were caught flat-footed, and in many ways, we're still trying to navigate that space. So yeah, we're working on it, but to describe the part that I think we're still missing and how this dynamic is playing itself out within our fellowship today, I have to tell you a little bit about my family history, and I'll start with grandparents. You know, we all love our grandparents, you know, and a lot of them are still with us. You know, we got great stories to tell about them. They take us fishing. They take you to buy stuff, they share their wisdom, and they generally all around spoil everybody. You know, the impact that they have on our lives, it can't be calculated. Why don't you take a look at this picture right here. This is my grandpa. This picture was taken in 1943 when he was about 30 years old. His name was Ben Meyer Houston. Now, this picture was taken 6 years before he brutally raped my grandmother when she was 14 years old. Yeah, we all love our grandparents, and our grandparents love us, but mine didn't. My grandpa raped black children for fun. And he was never charged or convicted with a crime because it was never reported. You see, this all happened about 60 miles away from where Emmett Till was murdered. And in those days, if you know anything about that situation, if you spoke up for black people, you went missing, just like Emmett Till did. So as long as everybody stayed quiet about it, as long as no one took action and no one responded, society stayed relatively peaceful. Incidentally, his wife on her deathbed made her family promise not to bury her anywhere near her husband. You see, she knew about his behavior, and yet she never divorced him, because as long as she stayed quiet too, as long as she looked the other way, she got to keep her life intact as well. So you got this 14-year-old 8th grader who was forced to bear an entire pregnancy term on her own and was forbidden to speak about what happened for fear for her life. But the truth here was unavoidable. She worked for the man who raped her, so notice the color of the child's skin. The testimony against him was etched into her flesh. So they had no choice but to run before anybody tried to destroy the evidence. Now, I'm not kidding. This actually happened. My grandmother had to hide that child to protect her from being killed or taken from her. So she traveled from Newellton, Mississippi, west to Northern California, and then she left her there with a family that could take care of her. Now that is how Evelyn Cecilia Hawkins came into this world, with violence, abandonment, mistreatment, and oppression in a society that was all too willing to act as if it never happened. That was my mom. And all my life, I watched my mother struggle through the pain of knowing who and what her father was. She was hated by her own dad. And he died having never acknowledged her existence. And to this day, that family won't acknowledge what he did or that we even exist. So what effect do you think that would have on a young girl? Well, I'll tell you, for most of her life, my mother hated herself. And she was convinced that she wasn't worth any more than the treatment she received in her life. She grew up rejected by her blood relatives, obviously. But she was also rejected by the black community as well, because she didn't look like any of them. She looked white. So in her adulthood, it involved drugs, self-harm, and all kinds of things, until late in her 40s, she began to pick herself up. And I'm a witness to that era. I wasn't yet 10 years old, and I witnessed my mother's blood just pouring literally from her head during a fight that she was involved in. Much later, when I studied the Bible with her, the biggest hurdle for her to overcome, it was trying to convince her that God actually wanted her. Because you see, her life story was proof to her that he didn't. And that damage was so deep, it took months before she believed it and became your sister. Now, I know it ended great, but it's a horrible story. And what's worse is that the rape of a black child by a grown white man happened not once, but twice in my family line. You see, the legacy of white brutality and abuse is documented. It's in my skin color. This is not the skin color of a black man. This is the product of 2 generations of rape victims that were subjected to a society that turned its back on us while it happened. They did nothing, they said nothing, and they looked the other way when we needed somebody to act. And I'm always reminded of that fact when I look into the mirror. Guys, this is not ancient history. That child is alive today to tell this story. So, let's recap. My 14-year-old grandmother was brutally raped by a 34-year-old married white man. And my great-great-grandmother was also raped by a white man while she was in her young teens. And those rapists died as upstanding citizens, never known for having committed a crime. Yet, as a black man, I'm the one who's considered to be more likely a criminal threat. I'm the one who gets to watch little old white women clutch their bags tighter on the elevator, or they roll up their windows and lock their doors when I walk past their cars in the street. I notice these things. It happens too often not to. You see, I'm the one who gets to think twice about approaching white women to invite them to church, especially at night. Who gets pulled over by the police for no reason, and then I watch as they kill other black people for the same stupid reasons why they stopped me. My story here is not unique. This is common in the black community, and most of us carry this weight on our shoulders. And I'm not trying to tell everybody a sob story, and I'm certainly not looking for anybody's sympathy. What I'm trying to do is show you exactly who it is and what it is that's walking through your church doors on Sunday morning. And I want you to consider something. What might be the heart condition of someone bringing this experience with them through those doors? And how does one conduct themselves in the company of someone who's been through that? How would you treat them? You see, many of our white disciples have already answered those questions. Let me tell you what they said to me just within the last year.
You're disrupting the peace of the church. You're making everything about race. You're just looking for attention. My life was hard too. You don't see me complaining. You're being a reverse racist. Racism is just a political, worldly. You're letting yourself get caught up in worldly affairs. You should concern yourself with more spiritual matters. Get over it. Racism ended when we freed the slaves. You're just bringing up dead. You're being divisive, bringing up racism. You're just pulling the race card. Obey the law and you won't be harassed. Jesus is Lord. That's all you need to focus on. You're being manipulated by the media. You are spreading leftist propaganda. You're the racist for bringing up racism. You've lost focus on Jesus. So the past is the past. I'm looking. Toughen up, Buttercup. You're too sensitive. You don't have the authority to speak on these issues to the church. It didn't happen to you personally. Why are you so upset?
So, when you answer that question, I sure hope that it didn't sound anything like that. You know, although it wasn't new to the Black community, the George Floyd murder was devastating. But I have to say that in some ways I was more alarmed by these kinds of responses coming from within the kingdom. It showed me that there is a disconnection between the scriptures we follow about love and God's grace and the real world application of them in an American racial context. The scriptures and these comments don't match. And in these comments, we see characteristics of gaslighting, dismissiveness, defensiveness, blaming the victim, denial, harshness, manipulation. We see an utter lack of compassion, empathy, or humility. You see, these are the terms here that are used to delegitimize, dehumanize, and marginalize the very things that oppression is designed to accomplish in the hearts and minds of its victims. And it's coming from the mouths of our own brothers and sisters. See, I know we don't believe in oppression. I know we believe in the love of God, but our normalized and unhealthy dominant culture, it influences us to think and behave in ways that contradicts those beliefs. And it seems to do so in a way that many of our white brothers and sisters don't seem to detect. Again, the methods of oppression are so normal in our culture that many don't realize that they're doing it. And they don't recognize that the negative effect that it's having on others when they do. You see, our society was designed in a largely segregated way. So white people rarely have to look at the day-to-day abuse that people of color are receiving. So it's really hard to convince them that there's even a problem. And their dismissal of Black life experiences is reflected here in the same way that we've seen coming from the world. As a result, Black people are experiencing this spiritual, mental, and emotional trauma of having our lives disregarded by those with whom we are supposed to be sharing the love of God with. See, you know, the intricacies of racism in the kingdom, culture, all that can be debated, but its product can't. It's always been the same, and it's observable in our fellowship today. The results are always found in the people. Don't ask disciples if they think racism is in the church. That's not going to give you an answer that you really need to know. One way or the other, positive or negative. Ask your Black disciples if they've heard these comments being made towards them. And ask your white disciples if they've said these things. We've all heard these comments before. People aren't shy about making these overflowings of the heart. You know, in a counseling environment, if you are being treated like this in your most intimate relationship, the most likely advice that you would get is to remove yourself from that relationship. But this is church. So for the sake of our commitment to God and his people, we've been obligating one another for years to continually subject ourselves to abuse that no one should ever have to experience, especially in the kingdom. So in the end, you find yourself tethered to this repetitiously abusive environment, kind of like a ball at the end of a ping pong paddle. Now, it's not every white person, obviously, but it's enough to cause damage, and it's enough to drive Black people away. And let's be clear, this is not a matter of insensitive comments where, a simple Matthew 18:15 conversation would suffice. There's too many instances of this for one person to address individually. Nor can this be dismissed as a simple difference of opinions on debatable matters, those comments reflect a moral orientation that offers little to no value to the lives and experiences of Black people. And the sheer volume of oppressive interactions here suggests that there's a cultural element to this, and the problem needs to be addressed from that vantage point. Failure to address this directly, it confirms that it's acceptable and normal to maintain that moral orientation. We can't continue to do that. So the question I keep asking is, why are people saying things like this? Where is this abuse coming from? Again, I'm just telling you what I see. Frankly, I think that people have a difficult time processing racial experiences that are different from their own, especially white people in America, because they're culturally conditioned not to concern themselves with Black life experiences. That Black reality is not relevant information to their daily lives, so there's very little interest or curiosity about it. I tell you what, for nearly 30 years, I've been a member of this church, and I've never been asked about my racial experiences by anyone in our church for that long. I find it to be extremely uncomfortable for white people when they're confronted with a racial reality that it so vastly contradicts their understanding of it. And the knee-jerk reaction is to resist it, to excuse it, to deny it, defend it, maybe to negate it in some way. For example, to this day, my grandfather's family has never been able to acknowledge the rapist that he was. And this denial is common coming from the world, but when it's in the church, it does great damage to our ability to reach all nations, because to reach and retain them, you have to be able to accept and be responsive to their reality. And it appears to me that not all of us are prepared, equipped, or willing to do that. You see, we were supposed to have built a spiritually inviting home for all nations to come. But for many Black people, the church experience has become nothing more than a heart-guarding exercise, where we have to navigate a minefield of dismissive, ignorant, arrogant, and culturally unaware white people. Again, it's not every white person, but it's enough to make Black people feel like they don't belong here. Now, I should be careful to point out that I'm not judging or condemning anybody for this. We were all taught to perpetuate or endure this culture since the day we were born, but that's not the main problem. The main problem, as I see it, is that many of us in church show no signs of awareness of our fellowship's oppressive culture, while others of us are contemptuous about it when people try to show it to them. This is a big problem. And in my discussions with people about white supremacy, I find that a lot of white people think that since they don't hate anybody personally, that that's all that they need to know about it. And they can drop the matter from there. And as long as everybody shows up to church on Sunday and there isn't any specific offenses to address, all must be relatively okay. And Black silence is mistaken for peace and unity. And their tolerance for this abuse is mistaken for love. And we mistake shallow proximity in our services for brotherhood. I know this is a trigger word, so I want to really be clear about what white supremacy actually is. It is not about hateful people, and it's not about the hateful acts they commit. It's not about skinheads, radicals, mean people, or KKK, domestic terrorism, or none of that. White supremacy is about selfish values. To be sure, selfish values are what drives those hateful acts, but it's more fundamental than that. It means that you minimize the issues and the people that you don't care about, and you elevate or prioritize whatever and whoever is worth more to you. And in this case, it's white culture. So to be clear, there's nothing wrong with white culture. It's just that it ceases to be a culture and becomes supremacy with the assumption that all other races need to fit or cater to your set of expectations. And to that end, it creates an environment that says that it's socially acceptable to ignore the needs of other races. That white people are morally free to pay no attention and are justified in their annoyance when somebody pushes the issue. White supremacy literally teaches people to lack empathy and to be unresponsive to people on the oppressed end of their culture. And this has created a white brotherhood that is woefully uneducated, unprepared, and ill-equipped to recognize, respond appropriately to the deeper challenges that are just under the surface of our fellowship. Most white supremacist values operate silently. But if you know what to look for, they're most observable in 4 ways. And number 1, you'll notice the patterns in the activities we do, the people we surround ourselves with, including leadership that we choose, how we spend our money, and by the cultural things that we reject. But its influence is interesting. It doesn't stop there. It doesn't stop with white people. It even influences the values of an extensively multicultural environment, just like ours. Have a look at this. These are all the evangelists and the elders in the church here in LA. And if you pause the video for a second and examine it, you'll see that it is an unusually diverse group racially. But you'll also notice that a robust Black leadership presence is conspicuously missing from this group. You see, this is a direct result of who and what we value and who and what we don't value. But to be fair, we do have some evangelists and elders who are Black, and that's worth noting. But my larger point is this. It's not about the numerical comparisons or the optics. It's that whatever the racial architecture of our leadership currently is, whatever integration achievements that we can claim, whatever that is, it still doesn't appear to be effective at stopping the methods of oppression that are happening within the church. The delegitimization, the dehumanization, and the marginalization of Black people is still happening, even in our multicultural environment. That suggests that yes, we are doing something about racism, but what truly needs to be done has yet to be done. You see, I've been accused many times of being divisive and disrupting the peace of the church for addressing racial issues. And they say the topic is like unspiritual, inappropriate, and out of place for a church. And I agree, it's a contentious issue, but I have a big problem with how they define peace and divisiveness. You see, from the perspective of the oppressed, we were never at peace to begin with. We were never undivided to begin with. It's just that our fellowship has grown comfortable with Black silence. Comfortable with Blacks suppressing what they actually experience and what they're feeling due to the pressure of our unhealthy, dominant culture. You see, the accusation of unspirituality is nothing more to me than a demand to suffer the church's oppressive culture, but to do it quietly. And I hear that expectation to be silent about the abuse I've experienced in the same way my grandmother would have heard it after being raped. It's that same awful song that's been sung to Black people throughout the history of this country. And the lyrics go something like this. You are not allowed, Black person, to disturb the lives of white people with the pain that they and their culture have caused you. It says, keep your pain and your oppression, which I contribute to as a white person, off my doorstep, because it's distracting me from worshiping my God, and you should never do that. So, what do you think all this communicates to a person who has a history like mine? I'll tell you exactly what it communicates to me. It says that I don't belong here. It says that I'm out of place to expect something better than that. And the longer that this goes unaddressed, the greater the guarantee that a person like me will be mentally, spiritually, or emotionally abused again in the future if I stay here. Now, I've been here nearly 30 years, and I'm still here because I believe that this is the kingdom. But can you start to understand now why I might struggle asking myself why I stay? And a lot of people, Black people, are asking this. They're asking questions like, will I find refuge from my oppression here? Or am I welcome to bring my racial burdens into this space? Sadly, the answer for many of them is no, because our burdens are inappropriate. They're unspiritual, they're divisive, they're political. The Black experience in America is a very, very heavy burden. And Jesus teaches us to bring all of that here to him and his people. But his people are telling us to take it elsewhere. See, all the Black people that I've spoken to over the years who felt that they didn't belong in our fellowship, of all of them, I have never been successful at convincing any of them to stay. So if you were talking to a Black person who's experiencing what I've described, what would you say to keep them from leaving? How would you make the case that they actually belong here under these circumstances? Titus 2:11-12 teaches us that God's saving grace is not simply forgiveness and reconciliation. It was also known to have an educational component to it. Grace is about being given the chance to do better as we learn better. And it teaches us to identify and reject things that are not of God. Racism and white supremacy are clearly not of God, but our inability to detect it within ourselves is having a destructive impact on our fellowship. And I think this is because the educational component of God's grace has been missing from our fellowship where racism and white supremacy are concerned. Teaching this topic is an act of grace, and it will help white people identify their own oppressive behaviors, shifting our culture that's within our fellowship to one that does no further harm to Black people. It'll show them how to identify and say no to the racial conditioning that's being taught by the world. You know, Maya Angelou, she once famously said, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And I believe we will all do better when we know better. So we can do this by teaching how the methods of racial oppression manifests itself within our church's social structure. We need to teach what led to it, what keeps it alive, the damage that it's caused, how to detect it, how to fight it, and how to repent of it. And we can develop a white supremacy and racism study, and we can include it in the discipleship study series so that people have a chance to count the cost on that. And they can make the connection between our oppressive culture and the scriptures that deal with it. And finally, I think we need to develop materials that offer tools of discussion, teaching us how to respectfully and lovingly handle difficult issues like this, openly. So, if I did my job correctly here, I've explained the toxic environment that Black people are facing within the church, how we got here, and how we can change it to make our fellowship better reflect Christ. I believe that as long as we're sinners, there will always be racism, so there's no end to it. But let's be clear though, I don't think that our job is to end racism. Our job is to make sure that our church isn't guilty of it. And right now, we are definitely guilty of it. You see, we can't accomplish our mission to make disciples of all nations if we're driving them away at the same time. I want to be a church who draws all nations to it and keeps them. I mean, at least as long as it takes to finish the work, teaching everything Jesus commanded. I think we can get there if we start teaching on this topic. You know, when confronted with their own racism, the white people in my family insisted that it didn't exist. And they do so to this day. And the damage that caused has remained an open wound since the day it happened a generation ago. Let's not be like them. Let's not be like the world who ignores the things that are too hard to address and who feels justified in ignoring the things that don't affect them personally. Let's address the normalized methods of oppression that are being used in our fellowship, and let's teach our church to say no to a culture that is not of God. Thanks for listening. I love you all. We'll talk soon.